And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room tonight already for our special part 2 of our 5-year anniversary of the X series. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, this is pretty interesting. PawGate 2 is the episode. We're into the second part of this revelation, and it is the ChacMool Atlantis mystery.
Excellent.
So we're going deep on this, and I think what we're going to find out tonight is all the points that we covered in the big reveal yesterday around this paw symbolism for the Hall of Records, stretching all the way from Egypt to the Yucatan. We're just going to go deeper with that tonight, and then we're going to take your questions on it. Also, we'll go, let's say, about 90 minutes tonight.
Okay, sounds good.
And it's the big follow-up on this. It's great to have so many of you here, and of course, you know, in starting off doing the X series work, let me tell you that there's been so much learning involved in doing it. But the X-STEGANOGRAPHY, I think, is a great reveal for us at this point in time. In particular, the X points not only to the advanced technology, the UFO file, which we heavily cover on this show, but it relates to these Atlantean ruins and the mystery schools, keeping that story alive even through the public mystery school channels of the 19th century. Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy, Theosophy, the Gurdjieff work, all of them were there with it. But tonight's even particularly special information comes to us by way of two very interesting psychics from the past. One, Edgar Cayce, of course, who needs no introduction, the sleeping prophet, who in over 900 life readings spelled out the entire history over 40 years of the Atlantean continent and how it influenced as a legacy culture. All of these incredible bursts of civilization, from the Egyptians to the Chaldeans to the Mayans and the Inca and beyond. But this is how tonight is going to really play out. The other psychic here is someone we brought to the fore yesterday, Augustus Le Plongeon, who is no stranger on this show in terms of covering the topic. And, you know, Le Plongeon has always been an interesting mystery to me because, you know, the time period he's in, late 19th century, he basically goes and discovers all the monuments that are there in Mayan Yucatan. And what's interesting to me is he always seemed to have this incredible flair for knowing what was going on, and he jumped ahead of everyone, connecting the Mayans with the Egyptians, and everyone drew upon him, from Blavatsky to Ignatius Donnelly, who wrote the real tome on Atlantis of that period. And Donnelly being a very, very interesting character indeed. That book is Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which still holds up in a variety of ways. That's how advanced it was. But he was a congressman from Minnesota who actually ran as vice president and had presidential aspirations. Can you imagine President Atlantis? Think about that. This guy knew his stuff. But you know, it's really interesting when we get into this level of detail with it. So tonight, the second part of the reveal of PawGate. PawGate, what we brought forward yesterday and what we'll bring forward tonight isn't anywhere. You're not going to find it anywhere. The sources, certainly, we've drawn forward on this program before, from the Steiner work, from the Cayce work, and the Le Plongeon work. But the motif connection of PawGate using the signature for this Atlantean Hall of Records mystery school and what they were doing with that paw symbology, it's been laying out there through the reading of Edgar Cayce when he's suggesting, well, you know, if you think about this Hall of Records, you can find it and you can locate it by the way that the sun comes over the Sphinx's shoulder and hits the right paw. It's a very interesting little clue that he leads there. And I'm actually going to read that reading tonight. But there's also something much more serious at the core of this, which is his history of the Giza Plateau takes us back to 10,500 BC. That's about 8,000 years earlier, as we know, than traditional archaeology. But here's another twist. Cayce says that that whole area was an archaeological dig for these Atlanteans coming in. So it was already an ancient area. And at one point, he suggests that it was underwater for 250,000 years. So there was a civilization there much older. And that when they're doing this activity in 10,500 BC, they're rebuilding the plateau. So how ancient are we talking about? That is the excitement and the mystery of PawGate, and we're going to get to it tonight. It is the special episode, and of course, it features Chak Mool, which is the incredible discovery of Augustus Le Plongeon, the psychic archaeologist who had done incredible excavations in South America, had been to India, and was born actually on Jersey Island and grew up in the UK, but came to the US and had a very unusual career, spent some time as a doctor, and then became a very popular photographer. And when photography was in its infancy, but his true passion was the Yucatan and then the connection to Atlantis. And he found himself right in the middle of it. And he took his lovely wife with him and said, will you go along for this journey? In 10 years, they were there right in the heart of Yucatan, Chichen Itza, and all those incredible discoveries. We're going to bring some of those details out tonight that we didn't cover last night. And I'm going to do a little bit of a recap on some of the major finds. I want to remind you before we go any further, especially if you're new, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch through this really kind of static, incredible censorship that we've been seeing going on. And it's fantastic. Basically, you'll get it once a week, and it'll give you an incredible look at the wonderful interviews that we have coming up for you with the likes of Gigi Young, Dr. Joseph Farrell, Catherine Austin Fitz, really just amazing. John Warner the Fourth doing incredible work, and some real surprises along that line too, and also really kind of remarkable X-series episodes that we have coming up for you in the summer as well. So with that all said, Miss Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Good. Jay Jackson says, DJ looking sexy AF. And Modway says, every girl's crazy about a sharp-dressed man.
Well, here's the thing. I had to try to top last year. Last year, I came out in the gold jacket, and you have to do something for the anniversary. And usually I do it on the first night, but last night there was such serious detail going on with that episode that there was no way to function. But tonight you got it. You've got kind of like the New Wave Mafia coming at you. Here's an interesting point also I want to make, which is if you, we're going to do questions tonight because we weren't able to get to them last night. The show just went on because we had these details, and thank God we were able to do it. I got a lot of great feedback from you guys after the show and this revelation around PawGate, which I want to stress is this isn't information that's available. So we're all of us together breaking new ground on this in the Ideas Room and right here on this channel, because this connection is going to ripple out through a number of different areas, and eventually it's going to get around to all of these different cliques that are looking into the Atlantis issue. And I can tell you right now, some of the most incredible minds that we have gone after this problem. But the thing is that they work in certain types of expertise, and I've seen this over and over again. What's interesting about the PawGate piece is, in some weird way, you have to kind of have hovered around the Cayce readings long enough, and then if something on the outside world kind of magnetically attaches to some of these readings. Now, he's been dead since 1945, but his work has grown and grown. And really, I want to say this, which is Edgar Cayce's work wasn't even really well known in his own era. It took really the 1960s and the whole Age of Aquarius kind of thing for people to get interested in Atlantis. And I think that was by design. But I think it was also by design that we got Cayce laying this foundation, this remarkable foundation, and how Egypt and the Mayans fit into it, and not to mention the Inca as well. And there's an interesting twist in there too about Og, which I'll get into as well. But that Giza Plateau, we're going to enter that Giza Plateau with Cayce tonight. We're all going to do it together. I'm going to show you how it's going to be very easy for us to tune in on those. And on the other piece of history, we're going to go straight into Chichen Itza and Piedras Negras, and we're going to find that crisscross of Augustus Le Plongeon and the work he was doing there. They're both available to us if we avail ourselves of the information that they left behind. And with that, I want to remind you also in the second half, we'll take questions. So Miss Olivia can put those together now. And what else you got?
They're debating what kind of a hat you need.
I don't wear hats. This is the interesting thing.
You used to have a fedora.
Yeah, but it's really, there's something that doesn't work. You can do hats fairly well, and there are some people who can just really get the hat thing down, but I'm not much of a hat guy.
Well, it'll flatten your hair.
Exactly. Well, it just grows straight up, as we know. It's terrific to have so many of you here. It's interesting. I do feel that there's some understanding that something is going to come forward about Atlantis, and that even the weird thing they've been trying to do with the UFO file, they're including this underwater aspect. There's an underwater threat. They realize that there's something on the Atlantis side, and they want to get their claws on it. So expect not only false disclosures aimed directly at this whole, UFO, UAP nonsense. UAP, forget it. There's no such thing as a UAP. Anyone who uses the language is ridiculous. It's a UFO, and it's a UFO file. Interestingly enough, you're going to see false UFO disclosure and false Atlantis disclosure. They're going to go hand in hand, and we're going to find ourselves whipped up right in the middle of that. So this is something where what I've been telling people about, I could just, you could almost say I'm warning people about it, really, when it comes right down to it, is potency. So, for example, Tucker Carlson talking to CIA people about UFOs is not disclosure. And the fact that these larger networks are just kind of skimming off the top of these subjects is actually not a good development, believe it or not. And it's going to make for a very watered down, wishy-washy type of system of information. The potency factor is going to be oh so crucial. The potency of the X series, the potency of G.G. Young's work, Graham Hancock, highly potent work, Dr. Joseph Farrell. You're going to need potency, and you're going to need to reject the fluff. People send me all the time different things, and it's great the way that people discover things or how they find things, however they want to do it. There's a million types of researchers and research to be done, but the piece that I hone in on is this carpetbagging, astroturfing network. Fox News, UFO disclosure, CNN special in Atlantis. These are not the healthy developments, because what they want to do is push a particular type of aim. So we need to really choose now that the subjects that we've been working on here in the X series over 5 years, but just in the space in general, like at Cayce's work, talking about this in the 1920s, Rudolf Steiner's 19th century, these people have gone back. ISIS Unveiled was 1875. Okay. So we've got a real history of this thing, and we're not going to let just a bunch of intel and marketing people come in and give you the fast food version and use a lot of buzz terms, So we're going to go for something a lot deeper, and the potency aspect is going to be crucial for us to consider going forward here in 2023. But it's great to have so many of you here with us, and I've reflected on the X series and the things that we've covered on the show, from the UFO file, Apotheum, the mystery schools, the Eighth Sphere, Rudolf Steiner's incredible descriptions of Ahriman and the technocratic spirit coming forward to trap humanity. In fact, these things, I think, are so, they've played out so ahead of their time that by the time we've arrived here, if you go back to 2018, a lot of the stuff that I was talking about, it almost sounds like mythology. And here we are right in the thick of it. And that, I think, is the advantage of going deep on these topics, which is there's something about that connection and that ping pong of us getting into these things that gives us those future glimpses. And the future aspect, it's not set. It's very important for us to have a handle on it. What we know for sure is they've been blocking very, very important information. and related to our ancient past for sure. And they've been hinting at, adopting this new narrative, human narrative for the past. And so we sort of need to beat them to the punch on an information and intuition level. And so that's where so many of the episodes in the X series, and this is X series 147 part 2, but there's 190 different episodes in the X series because there's a lot of part 2s and supplementary things. So really what we're looking at is 190 episodes of this over the course of time covering these subjects. And I'll tell you, I couldn't want to do anything better than this, really, because that fascinating exchange around things that I'm so interested in, and being able to deliver that and do these reports for you is just absolutely exciting. So thank you very much. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm going to dive in. What do you got?
Nothing much. Sylvie Cat says, I see great potential within this episode. And Scott NYC says, digging our paws in deeper.
Well, it's PawGate. You've arrived at PawGate. This is new. This is something that has not been hitherto explained. And yet the sources have been sitting there facing us from these mystery schools and other sources for decades. And here's the real kind of crisscross in all of it. The Atlantean Hall of Records that Edgar Cayce spoke so artfully about are located in 3 locations, he said, in the earth. One of those locations was under the Sphinx, Right Paw. What we learned later as we go deeper is the entrance is there, but the actual Temple of Records, the Hall of Records, is between then the Sphinx and the Nile River. Then we've got the Bimini Poseidian Temple. And Poseidia has to be remembered in the Cayce readings and that kind of cosmology that surrounds Atlantis. Poseidia is kind of the major holdout of the Emilius group. And they are the group who is using the technology in a very spiritual fashion to interact with the saintly realm, the outer spheres. And they train their priestesses to use the two-eye stone to do that. The Belial group is dedicated to dominance, and they sound like about the worst characters you can imagine. And by the time we get to when Atlantis breaks up around 10,500 BC, they have really, done everything they can to take out the Emilius group. The Emilius group is there in the hot zone, and there's still a landmass there, which Edgar Cayce identifies as the island Poseidia. And there's a temple there that was in Bimini that was a very important temple for the Poseidians. Once that area sinks, the final exodus of the Poseidians, either to the Yucatan or to South America or to Egypt or the Pyrenees, happens with some stops along the way, maybe like the Azores. And we've heard some things a lot of people have talked about. Well, they found this thing in the Sahara that looks like it. Look, there's an egress in the Cayce readings directly into the Sahara of the Atlanteans. But Atlantis is Atlantis. And it's identified by Plato between the Straits of Hercules on one side, the Rock of Gibraltar, and it's that whole outer ocean. The mystery schools say Gulf of Mexico on one side, the Rock of Gibraltar, Mediterranean on the other. It's that landmass in between. And there's a point in time, according to these mystery schools, where they unintentionally tune the technology of the two-eye stone too high because the sons of Belial are doing all these different things with it. So it's the equivalent of kind of like a massive Chernobyl style event. And it splits the island into 3. And Cayce names the islands Poseidia, which is the one in the hot zone, Cuba, Bahamas. And then we have Arion and Og. And Og seems to be the closest to South America. Now, those islands basically become very split up and splintered. So you almost get a civil war type activity going on over time. And by the time, like I said, we get to 10,500 BC, there's major war and major incoming war by the Belial group against the Emilius followers there in the Bahamas. And once that sinks, Bimini is the last remnant. And what I think I've determined through the work of some of the people around this whole Druid piece around Murius is that a piece of Bimini, a larger piece, say between Bimini, Cuba, and the Yucatan, was still there for a while after the whole major Atlantis sinking and the deluge that followed. But that eventually went down also because there are remnants of something larger than just Bimini there. But Bimini is the last of that continent there. Cayce is very specific about it. There's something very important about that area. And he pointed it out before anyone else did. But what's interesting, one of the things we brought out in our Hot Zone specials on this show, is that Ernest Hemingway's mother was very close with Cayce. He gave her readings for Ernest, and Ernest got readings. And so then Ernest shows up in the middle of the Bimini Island. And that's interesting. So there's a series of episodes we did tracking Ernest Hemingway and his activities in the hot zone, including in Cuba, and the fact that he was obsessed with what was under the water. And then that Lester Hemingway, his brother, found New Atlantis right there in right off Jamaica. So there's so many tentacles to the story around the hot zone. What I want to do tonight is take us further into this PawGate aspect. And so the second of the Hall of Records there, the Poseidon Temple, which Cayce said, you know, it's going to start to rise. 1968 and 1969, you're going to see some of it. That's when they found the Bimini Wall. So that's the piece there. We're going to see more of that because land is rising. Very important for us to understand that. We don't hear a lot about that, but land is rising. Scientists don't tell you that. But if you dig deep, you start to find some strange things here. For example, Japan just discovered, hey, we have 7 new islands. We never knew that. I guess we undercounted. Yeah, or they're rising. So there's a lot of pieces here. But remember this whole thing about as lands go down, and we've heard about these earth changes, and you've heard about, oh, climate change is going to, you know, raise the ocean levels and submerge the coast. Well, when things go down, other things come up. And the come up part you never hear about. But I'm sure that these people organizing these things around climate emergencies and stuff are totally aware that land is rising. And we need to be as well, because that's vouchsafed for us by the mystery schools directly. And you find it shining right there in the middle of the Cayce work. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is PawGate Part 2, and it's Chacmool, the Atlantis mystery revealed. And we're going to do that through the figure of archaeologist Augustus Le Plongeon. And I want to remind you that we're going to take your questions in the second part of the program. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia.
Seven Synesthesia says, notice how Gaga puts paws up for her little monsters? Just saying.
Wow. Excellent point, actually. Well, she's just, you know, I'm sure she's deep into the occult edge of this. No question about it. But for those people, you know, and we've seen that with Ghislaine Epstein connections and all that, that those people are hunting out the Belial connection. They want it back. You know, so they haven't learned the lesson at all. There's a whole Belial cult operating among those groups. And they called in, as we pointed out in episodes dealing with Ghislaine Maxwell and her connection with the hot zone, that, you know, they called in some of the top scientists to research this with them. So they're right on top of it. What else you got?
Jiriki says, thinking on the Jaguar Sphinx Thunderpaw and Hoagland's Dark Mission, in it he digitally enhanced Mars's Sphinx to the point where its face resembled a lion. Jaguar, question mark, your thoughts?
Oh, I think there are ruins in space. But I'll tell you what's interesting is I've gone into some of the theosophical twists around Atlantis. And if you really study it, there's a thread that is all about the Atlanteans attaining spaceflight, which Cayce says that they do. And that there's a group of them that lift off and dedicate themselves, because they don't want to face the destruction, but they dedicate themselves to coming back and reseeding everything And then we get around this alien connection, and you wonder just how human this advanced technology piece is after all. And you know me, I'm a big person into off-world civilizations visiting here, but I think we have a number of things to consider on that tip. But yeah, ruins in space, they've been keeping that from us for a while. What else you got?
Debbie McAdoo says PawGate is related to Lionsgate, as in the Lionsgate portal.
Oh, that's interesting. Any of the imagery around the lion, Rudolf Steiner says in our evolutionary track, it relates to our heart. But think of how important the heart is when it comes to just our everyday life as a symbol. If you don't have heart, the whole thing around being a Christian is to have an open heart. And so these types of things, I think, are important symbolically. There's a reason why we've got this image of the Sphinx out there. And I'm going to explain that what happened is one of the big reveals from last night that I'll expand on tonight, which is that Augustus Le Plongeon discovered a Sphinx in Yucatan. You never hear about that. Well, I found out that it disappeared at the end of the 19th century. This artifact is gone. But the pictures and the documentation remain. And we're going to see why that's so important. And somebody was on the ball getting that thing out of there. Because if you've got a Sphinx over there and they've got the whole paw connection with the Hall of Records, then somebody somewhere is aware of this. It's only Cayce that tells us, well, you've got these 3 Hall of Records, and one is buried deep in the Yucatan. And it was buried there by Iltar, which Edgar Cayce poses as a kind of Atlantean Noah who's run around to his countrymen saying, change your ways. And, there's a great tumult to come, and they ignore him largely. So he heads out with 50 followers, and he goes to Yucatan, and he sets up a civilization there, which mirrors Atlantis. And within 20 years, it's doing quite well as the actual Atlantis is sinking. So buried deep there in the jungles of the Yucatan in 1932, Cayce is giving these readings about these Penn State expeditions. Pennsylvania State Museum is how he identifies it. And they're going in there and they are making these discoveries. And he says these stones that they're finding that they don't know anything about, they're magnetized stones. The Atlanteans call them firestones. They're basically miniature versions of this much larger power station. And he says you can actually see emblems of them in the stones themselves, but the emblem will be shipped to the Pennsylvania State Museum and to a place in Washington that deals with such findings, which is instantly the Smithsonian, to my mind. So this becomes really important when we're looking at the whole thing. And for years, Penn State has said, no, we've never heard anything about this. Leave us alone. But it was learned that they were not in Yucatan, but deeper into Guatemala, right on the border there with Mexico, in a place called Piedras Negras. Now, Piedras Negras is very important to this conversation. And if you go back to the maps around the period that Cayce is giving, in fact, that whole peninsula, the whole area right down through Guatemala is called Yucatan. So things changed later. So Cayce is, in fact, identifying this site, which really meets all of the different things he was saying about it. But most importantly, it's the third place where the records of the Atlanteans are hidden. And those records contain all the information about the Atlanteans and that history there, the Lemurians, and also all the information about the construction of these 2-eye power stations, which dealt with this gigantic crystal. And we got into that last night. But basically, in a nutshell, you can think about the 2-eye stone as this communicating this wireless energy everywhere. And it gives them flight. It gives them all kinds of different conveniences, and it's a really advanced technology. But remember, the group in there that's developed it is the Amelius group, and they've learned how to interface with spiritual forces using that 2-eye stone. The Belial group kind of infiltrates the Amelius group, and then they start to figure out they have very material applications for this. This is the Cayce story. And remember, his story of Atlantis goes on over the course of about 200,000 years. Think of what we've compressed into what, almost 250
Mhm.
in America. So, a lot of things can shift around. Well, here's another interesting thing. The period where that kicks off with Emilius, is quite fascinating because the state that humanity is in is quite remarkable, in that you have these Atlantean scientists playing with matter, and they are projecting these kind of monstrosities. And what the Emilius group does is they set up a pure channel, and Emilius himself projects, and they try to learn. The Belial group tries to learn how he's doing this, but he's creating this kind of perfect form. And what happens is, this is a key inside the mystery schools. It's very hard when we think about this in relation to general evolutionary teachings, but there's a lot that's been left out around this. But he has, in the mystery schools from Steiner to Blavatsky, have, a quarter of a million years ago, both sexes in one. So it's a unisex being that we're dealing with who reproduces itself. And the separation of the sexes is something that Emilius starts to do. This is the course he figures out that will kind of save the day. And so Emilius is a very early Christ figure, and he leads these initiates, these Atlantean initiates, on this different course. And over time, the Belial group infiltrates the Emilius group, and we get this clash. And the Belial group starts to commandeer the larger part of Atlantis, and then they start using the two-eye stone for a lot of things it wasn't invented for, including conquest. But at a certain point, they unintentionally set these stones too high. This is the story. So everything that happens in the aftermath, what I call the apotheum afterglow of Atlantis, and all the distortions and the weirdness, and even what's left over in the Bermuda Triangle and the hot zone, where things disappear into dimensional reality, that's all based around this two-eye stone destruction. Now, were there other things involved? A comet strike, pole shift? There's no question, but these things were related, because what Cayce says is that the Atlanteans set off the fires from inside the earth. He's giving us the impression they're the ones who are doing it. It's not just happening by itself. So that becomes important for us to consider as well as we go forward here. Le Plongeon was very lucky to have Alice Le Plongeon with him, because not only was she very good at photography, she was an excellent writer, and just with her own scientific bent, she had this same kind of Renaissance quality that Le Plongeon had. And so she was able to balance out, giving lectures at the Theosophical Society and doing this very kind of straight ahead archaeology. This is a shot of them in 1878, and they're in Chichen Itza. And this is just, their routine, which is they're going to go to the next pyramid, and with a group, they're going to remove all the foliage and all the jungle from it, and they're going to start to find out what it's all about. What happens is, while Le Plongeon is there, he hooks up with about 300 natives of the area who still understand the Mayan language, and he goes and he seeks out the wise men around this. This is an important piece, because he comes forward and says, I've got the translation, just like the kind of Rosetta Stone, for these buildings. And so he submits that to the American Archaeological Association. And at the time, they're busy in a war with American Indians, trying to, put them on reservations and all this kind of stuff. They don't want to hear anything about these super intelligent native groups at all. So that's what we get, which is this kind of whitewash in history. Here's a few things when we consider where Le Plongeon was coming from. It's very important. Here's his quote. Whoever has read history knows that in all nations, civilized as well as uncivilized, from the remotest antiquity, the priests have claimed learning as the privilege of their caste, bestowed upon them by special favor of the ruling spirit of the universe. For this reason, they've zealously kept from the gaze of other men their intellectual treasures and surrounded them with the veil of mystery. They have carefully hid all their discoveries, scientific or artistic, under the cover of symbols, reserving their esoteric or secret meaning for the initiated. Steganography. In fact, Le Plongeon was both a kind of scientific genius and a psychic. So he's an odd character in this, but he gives us an enormous key for PawGate with Chacmool, and we're going to get into that. We touched upon it yesterday. We'll go even deeper on it tonight. And like I said, having his wife there, who was so expert on photography, she was deep on philosophy, deep into theosophy, and we find that she has her own esoteric abilities as well. So they're very much at home when they get into these Mayan lands and they're in Yucatan, and all of the tribesmen and people around them speak in very almost superstitious terms about psychic abilities and visions and all these things. This is something that they're actually quite comfortable with. Le Plongeon, I think, some of the things that Manly P. Hall said about him was that he's basically the world's first psychic archaeologist, and that he would know after spending time in a place where the ruins were and what they related to. And so the idea that he adopted the Mayan language before anybody is really interesting, because although he's rejected in his own era of the 1880s, even with these incredible discoveries, and he discovers Chichen Itza. I mean, he's on record for that, and all these other incredible places. Nobody's down there doing anything on the scale that he's doing. Later, his work in the 1930s, 1940s, suddenly Penn State, Yale, all these other groups are down there, and they are doing these deep examinations in Yucatan, and they're going back to the things that he said and say, oh yeah, actually that turned out to be true. It's an amazing arc. Of course, if he's operating in the 1870s and 1880s, then there's, it's nowhere near the kind of technical proficiency that we can have now. However, many of the monuments and many of the places became disturbed, and there was also a big spin going on in archaeology. They wanted to keep this as, oh, hey, these primitive cultures that did human sacrifice, they didn't want to give them the credit for having the incredible astronomical mathematical abilities that they had. So he is giving us the kind of pure version of that, and are there going to be mistakes in the things that he says? Well, he doesn't have a worldwide geomapping system the way we do, but he's doing the best in his era, and that combination of hitting things on this raw angle before they're spoiled by academia is quite important. Here he is with his most impressive discovery, Chacmool. Chacmool is a very important character in history, and there's a few reasons for that. Chacmool is this figurine, this kind of warrior figurine, but he's sitting in an almost subdued pose, as you can see there. That is Le Plongeon discovering him in 1876. And this is a psychic discovery. Now, Le Plongeon goes on to track the story of Queen Mu and Chacmool. And Chacmool is this hero character. And basically, the parallels with Queen Mu and Chacmool and Osiris and Isis is interesting, except, when he studies it, he says, well, Osiris and Isis are mythological characters, but these two are real. I know because I've tracked the story. So he starts to get the impression that the story that comes to us from Egypt about Osiris and Isis is based on what these people did, because as he learns about them, he finds that they came from Atlantis, the central motherland that the Mayans called Aztlan, and they came into the Yucatan. So they were fleeing the destruction at first, and they were part of setting up this new society. So at a certain point, the story mirrors the Isis-Osiris story so well, because it is, in fact, this other family member that kills Chacmool. So Chacmool is also interesting because of the name identification. Again, the name means Thunder Paw. So we have the paw again as the overhang here, and then we have the thunder piece. This is, something signifying great force. And all of these statues and tribute are made to him. Now, the dating that Le Plongeon gives is much earlier than traditional history gives around this. So we have to keep that in mind and give him a little leeway on that as we go as well. That is the Paw Stone glyph. And when we get to Piedras Negras, the Spanish call it the Black Stone. And the Mayans, though, had a different name. They called Piedras Negras the Paw Stone, and there's a reason for that. Just like the Hall of Records that's hidden beneath the paws of the Sphinx, or the right paw of the Sphinx, this signature, this crossover signature now for the other Hall of Records, Piedras Negras, we're also getting the signature of this Paw Stone glyph. And if you connect that further, we can thread the predictions of Edgar Cayce around the Sphinx, the Egyptian Mystery School, and this Atlantean group coming into the Yucatan that Le Plongeon discovers Thunder Paw. That's the Chak Mool story. And the reason that they're such a threat and that they, bring this amazing culture that's so above anything that's going on there at the time, all of these things add up if we understand we're talking about a central legacy culture, a main culture, and the legacy cultures that it creates in Egypt and in Mexico. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight in part 2 of PawGate, and we're going to go about another hour with you. It's fantastic to have so many of you here with us. We're going to take questions in the second half, but I still have more to get to for you, and we're going to get to that as well. And this is our 5-year anniversary show of the Dark Journalist X series, and let me tell you, it's fantastic to be able to do this work, and it seems more timely than ever. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Cindy Taylor had a really interesting comment. It says, on that winged jaguar installation at the UN, take a peek at that right raised paw.
Oh, interesting.
Something to follow up on.
Yeah, I absolutely will. Oh, yeah. Well, let me tell you, those are exactly the types of people and places that are going to know about this. I wanted to give us a handle on this Chacmool and show you some other versions. I showed some last night. I've got some other ones here as well. Is that all that you had?
I've got so much, I'm swamped.
Right. Yeah. Okay. If you want, no, it's okay. You can hit with another one. If you
Okay. So I did. Creatus Tarot from last night said the reclining Buddha lying on his right side, his head resting on a cushion or on his right elbow. It's meant to show that all beings have potential to be released from the cycle of death and rebirth.
It's very interesting. I think with the Chacmool, it's a sacred pose. And I think that from what I know about it, this is my own interpretation of what's happening there. I think that he's showing the operational position of the Firestones. And this is how I think it makes sense that these Chacmools are throughout the society. And it's supposed to be that you approach using the Firestone in a sacred fashion. And I think that that is what he represents. Later, the Aztecs, long after the actual use of the Firestone has gone out, they will use it for all sorts of kind of harsh purposes. So, and I found kind of a slacker version of it that I'm going to show you tonight as well. And it's called the Swimmer. It's quite unusual. But here's just a little bit about it. The distinctive posture of the Chacmool is what allows many scriptures to be united under one term. In all cases, the figure reclines on his back, his knees bent, and his body on a single axis from neck to toes. The elbows rest on the ground and support the torso, creating a tension as the figure strains to sit upright. The hands meet at the chest, usually holding either a disc or a vessel. The head rotates 90 degrees from the axis of the body to present a frontal face. This is the thing. It's there. You're seeing it. Even though the body's in a posture, the face is always facing you. This recumbent position represents the antithesis of aggression. It is helpless and almost defenseless, humble and acquiescent. These salient qualities of the Chacmool's posture are the same characteristics that describe classic Maya figures appearing on altars and carved stairs. It's interesting because they try to do crossover with Chacmool. I've read these studies, some of them done, one of the major ones was a Yale study on this. And all they can do over and over again is try to connect Chacmool to these later sacrifice sites. The problem with that logic is the timing is all wrong, one. And two, when they do the comparisons and you look at it, it's a joke. They don't look anything similar. It looks like the civilization downgraded and this other thing was happening. But, they just have their heads stuck in one version of this thing. And they're also like, well, maybe it was 500 AD. Well, I'll tell you, Plongeon is putting them more back to like 5000 BC. So let's clear up some of those discrepancies. A little bit about Le Plongeon, then we're going to look at some of these Chacmools. And so he discovered it. It was not on the boards before. He was excavating a platform at the site of Chichen Itza, and they came across a Chacmool. Le Plongeon said it was a statue of a prince, and that the prince's name was Chak Mool. Chak meaning thunder, Mool meaning paw. The source that says Le Plongeon chose Chacmool said that at first he thought it meant great jaguar paw. The source that says he chose Chacmool says Stephen Salisbury changed it into Chacmool in the writing. So the writing was ever so slightly different. One had an extra A. No big deal there. Le Plongeon wanted to take the Chacmool to an exposition called the Centennial Exposition in 1876, Philadelphia. And instead, the Mexican military came in and seized it. And they put it in the main Mexican museum there. That is Chacmool. And the story that we get from the person who discovered it is based on what he said of the Mayan hieroglyphs that were in the temple called the Jaguar Temple. And the story is this, that he, along with Queen Mu, came in from this Aztlan central Atlantis place, and while it was under destruction, and they came to rebuild society, and they created a new Atlantis there in Yucatan, and he became known as this kind of divine warrior character. Now, it's interesting. I've shown that the image itself has proliferated, and so we get later versions that are still using the same pose. So we're getting, again, just like in Egypt with the Sphinx, kind of the archetypal version of this. Now, I found these later versions from Costa Rica, and I find this interesting. They're still trying to hang on. They're not even really human, but they're still trying to hang on to the general posture and what it represents. Take a look at that. Miss Olivia, I don't know if I showed you that one. Take a look at that.
Wow.
Isn't that remarkable? Wow. Just an amazing shot. But in Yucatan, there's a very distinct flavor of the Chacmool, as if the prototype that he discovered was really the main one from his actual temple. And then we get these others. And as you go right down the line, you know that they carry this incredible message. The one that was confusing is this kind of slacker version one. And they call it the swimmer. No one knows what to make of it because the knees are down and the posture's different. So I don't know what to make of this one, but it is a later version, and I wonder if they just didn't know what it was all about. But it's interesting nonetheless. In some of the later versions also, and particularly in one of them, they found a lot of underwater symbols of sea creatures underneath it. Now, I find that interesting. It might represent the origin of Chacmool there in the Atlantic Ocean. That was on the bottom of one of the Chacmool statues from the later period, and it's got, starfish and all this kind of stuff. Okay, a little bit more on these images. Here's some, once they figured out, Le Plongeon was like, there must be a lot more of these. We can go out, fan out in different directions. Suddenly they started finding them all over the place. they didn't even know what they were before. And now here's Le Plongeon leading this whole Chacmool craze there in the Yucatan. Later, it just becomes part of the culture, and you can see much later versions of it here. Chacmool, again, Thunder Paw. Again, we have this tie-in, even though his temple is there in Yucatan, we have this tie-in if you just go down into Piedras Negras on the border of Mexico and Guatemala. And there again, we have Piedras Negras, which is the Paw Stone. And then we have the Sphinx, Right Paw, and the Atlantean Hall of Records. And then we have Cayce telling us, well, that other Hall of Records is in Yucatan, and Iltar, the Atlantean Noah, put it there. These things and the paw motif is how we're going to open this entire mystery up. And it's been sitting there. You know how long people have been talking about the Hall of Records? Well, Cayce gave the predictions in the 1930s. So this is a long time. And, you know, in the 1990s, it looked like we were getting somewhere with it. I covered some of that last night. You had guys like Robert Bivol and Robert Schoch and Graham Hancock working together on this. And the pushback at the top, you know, the kind of Giza Gate version of PawGate here, was from Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner, who controlled the plateau. And both of them, as I stated yesterday, were put on the map and funded by the Edgar Cayce Foundation. As a matter of fact, one of them wrote a book all about the Cayce readings and the Atlantis tie-in and the Hall of Records, and his name is Mark Lehner. So he's retired now, but he still, you know, shows up in the middle of this whenever they need someone to debunk the versions. Yeah, what do you got?
Hal Colombo said Rita Hayward gave good face. I know, the voguing. I'm trying to find this. Someone said something about a water sacrifice. Yeah, a levity looks like a water sacrifice.
What looks like a water sacrifice?
That, well, the
Chak Mool?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's very clear from the, you know, research of Le Plongeon that this is not a sacrifice figure. It's very important for us to get wrapped around that, because if we get that in our heads, we're going to be stuck in Aztec torture, you know, and feeding the hearts to the gods and all that kind of stuff. This has nothing to do with that. They may have adopted this. This is much earlier, thousands of years early, go all the way back. And when Cayce talks about the Iltar group, he says, although this is way before the human sacrifice stuff. So that's not what this is about. But it is interesting that you mention a water, because there is associated with some of the Chacmools. I find this interesting, and I'm going to read a quote about it. They have found liquid mercury in some of these temples, and there was a suggestion that there was a divination process with mercury around the Chacmool. That, to me, sounds more along the lines of what we're talking about. And I also think creating that sacred environment to activate these miniature Firestone versions that Cayce talked about, those images, I think we're going to find the crisscross there. Yes.
You know, that reminded me of a video that I saw this week about mercury and anti-gravity.
Oh, interesting. Yes. Yeah. Well, we get a lot of strange things. Even the Indian texts, you know, talking about Vimanas and things like that, we get a lot of that hint that, you know, well, they're using mercury in relation to this. There's no question that there are elements involved with how we achieve, you know, these kind of almost superhuman feats. When you look at the Aztec version of Chacmool, you can see them using it for totally different purposes by then. But that's thousands of years later, literally. So, you know, and we don't know what they would have used it for, you know. I mean, I guess it's the equivalent of, you know, when they burned the witches under, you know, it's supposed to be for a Christian purpose, right? You just, you know, the thing degenerates to a certain degree and to a point, and you get this kind of insanity. You know, you get the, well, look at what happened to the Templars. You know, these are the types of things that happen. One of the things that I'd like to point out and go back to is the fact that Cayce talked about the magnetized stones in Yucatan and how those altars would work, and how the the two-eye stone and the fire stones would be activated by being magnetized, and they would be magnetized on these altars. And these are the types of stones that they discovered there in Piedras Negras in Paw Stone. So, we're getting that feel, we're getting that whole impression. And I think if the deeper excavations around this were done, as we know Penn State did, eventually they got around to testing the radiation. But one of the things that Cayce pointed out was these stones they're developing now that they know so little about. But he also says they're being excavated now, and his whole vocal timbre changes when he says that. He's giving this reading in December of 1933. So he's saying that's when these excavations are taking place. I showed this one yesterday, but I want to drill it home because I'm doing more investigating on it. But it is a scarab that was uncovered in Egypt fairly recently, and they have the image there of a sphinx on it, and then underneath it is a Hall of Records, and the Hall of Records has the X-STEGANOGRAPHY on it. So see if you can follow me on this one. See what I can do here. That's your Sphinx there. There's the X Hall of Records beneath him. These are the types of things that may provide the breakthrough for us understanding. Oh, it's built into the culture. They understand this. So we're getting more of those as time goes on. These things are starting to open up for us. So I think now we have the understanding around Chacmool and what it represents. But how about that story? What is it in Le Plongeon's worldview that makes him compare Chacmool and Queen Mu to, obviously incredible figures setting up the early Yucatan civilization? But how does he compare them with this Isis Osiris piece? And he's so convinced of it. And, we don't have to accept that he's right or wrong in relation to it. But it's interesting that he had got so much of this right for him to crisscross the Maya and the Egyptians on this level. I think is fascinating. The only image provided of Queen Mu is from one of the temples there in Yucatan that still was standing by the time they got there. That is the image of Queen Mu there. At the bottom, there's her headdress and everything, but that is the image that we get of Queen Mu, and it almost looks Romanesque. You can see that Atlantean flavor. This is definitely an outside culture coming in and blending in, shall we say. But there's a lot of X-STEGANOGRAPHY all around that kind of question mark hookup here, which for those of you who know how much I watch for these things, there's a lot of X-STEGANOGRAPHY around the Chacmool Queen Mu story. And I think there is kind of a hint there that, the way that Le Plongeon describes it is once Chacmool is killed, very much like the Osiris hero is killed, then she has to flee. And she takes off, and they think that she's heading back to Atlantis. This is the way the story goes. And they're like, didn't Atlantis sink? And she says, no, like on the other side, I have these compadres. And she goes over. And so the implication on Le Plongeon's side is that Queen Mu goes to Egypt, and with the rest of the Atlanteans that are already there, she contributes to that culture, and that's where we get the Isis Osiris imagery, and it is directly related to Chacmool. The only reason that I think that bears a very strong consideration is because we have Cayce talking about the Atlanteans putting the Hall of Records in 3 different places in the earth. And the fact that he mentions Yucatan on one side and Egypt on the other means there's a crisscross in there somewhere. And it has to do with PawGate. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep tonight on PawGate 2. We're doing well, I think, on time. We'll have about 40 minutes for your questions. And I'm going to try to wrap up my presentation here in about 15 minutes. I want to thank everyone for being on this journey with us over the course of the last 5 years. This is the 5th year anniversary of the X series. And For me, a lot of the things that I learn as we go along in this process is that the more that we study about the mystery schools and understand about Atlantis, the more that things like advanced technology, the UFO file, and these other pieces fit together. And we get a much better handle on it when we know our own past. And in fact, this is one of the things that I've brought up before in interviews, with Gigi and Dr. Farrell, which is that really, when you get right down to it, Atlantis disclosure, or the disclosure of our own advanced past, is in a way a more advanced disclosure than UFO disclosure, because UFO disclosure, you have this kind of thing coming in from the outside, and it's basically a peer and all the rest. But what's being implied in the mystery schools and in the Cayce readings is this civilization in Atlantis that could do fantastic, amazing things, including space travel. So if we get a handle on that and we're able to come up with that kind of disclosure, it changes our whole image about ourselves. And that is really what this is all about, not some kind of advanced ET coming and giving us a new environmental code or something. And I think that's important kind of worldview. But, I know that there's something heavy, very heavy, that they've been hiding in relation to UFO disclosure, and the UFO file approach and the things that we need to do there, I think, are absolutely crucial. So this show, it has this kind of twin parallel course as it goes down. We've got the mystery school realizations around Atlantis and the Cayce work and Steiner and Gurdjieff, and all of the things that are, creating kind of a new mystery movement. And then side by side with that, we have all of the X-STEGANOGRAPhy they've been using to hide the UFO file. And, it's been interrupting and impacting our situation in relation to geopolitics, in relation to economics, in relation to space flight, and, just across the board. So we're right where we need to be in terms of investigating these things. And as we get those answers, we get that kind of wider ripple out. Sometimes, I swear to God, the thing that they try to prevent with these lockdowns and with their big kind of fascist overreach are the kinds of conversations that we have right here on this show in the Ideas Room. And so I certainly appreciate it. Miss Olivia, you're up.
There's a lot of discussion about the mercury. I think we could do a show just on that.
Okay.
Pumpy Gooch says, river of liquid mercury found under the Pyramid of the Moon in Teotihuacan.
Oh,
Jason
right.
May says, a bunch of mercury was found in the tomb of the Yellow Emperor. And isn't mercury used in the Daglaca?
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
I'll tell you what, if you put a pin in that, I've got here, and I will get to it before we're done. I have an actual anecdote about the mercury that I included. I printed that out for tonight. All right, let's get back to Egypt for a minute. We're taking that flight across from Yucatan. We're going into Egypt. And we're going to go there through the figure of Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce is giving these dramatic readings in the 1920s, the 1930s, and 40s. And he is opening up the subject of Atlantis like never before. I think that Theosophy does a great job of telling us about Atlantis. I think Ignatius Donnelly and all of the 19th century work does it. I think Steiner gives us incredible insight on it. But I don't think anywhere there is quite the impact and the dot connecting and the history that there is in the Cayce readings about life in Atlantis. So this came up, and he often would emphasize that it is very much associated with the period that we're in now, and that the Atlanteans are coming back, that is being reborn through reincarnation. Remember, this is a Sunday school teacher. It's not easy for him to communicate these things, but he did. And they're coming back to face the same exact challenge that they faced before and failed, which is the technology overran them. They lost their spirituality, and the world suffered and entered basically a dark age for many, many years. So this is where he's coming from on it. But the kind of impact that the readings have, and the fact that he's able to pinpoint things, and that these things later, when they look at them 6 7, 8 decades later, they find, oh yeah, the readings were exactly right about that. Where is this vision with Cayce coming from? And there's the suggestion there that somehow Cayce is associated. He's part of the conduit of the mystery schools being able to get this message out so that it will hit in the 60s and the 70s, and then it blossoms out into our era. And, we've done a lot of different things with it. You've seen a New Age movement kind of go over the top about it. And you've also seen this kind of huge negativity where they're like, oh, the Atlanteans were all terrible, when in fact it was the highest culture ever on the earth, according to Cayce. And the exceptional nature of the Atlanteans, the fact that they had these incredible psychic abilities, that the whole culture was telepathic, that they were using this two-eye stone. I'm going to let the Cayce readings speak for themselves on this. What I want to point out is when we're talking about the Sphinx, and the Sphinx comes up in these readings in particular, notice over and over again that he emphasizes that they're rebuilding. So the period he's talking about is 10,500 BC, and they're already rebuilding in the Giza Plateau and rebuilding the Sphinx. So this is a much, much older structure than anything that we've thought about before. All right, here's a reading given to someone who was involved in that process, according to Cayce. And so Cayce's gone deep into trance on this, and he says, before that, we find the entity was in the rule when the king and the Egyptian forces gave the greater knowledge of the indwelling of the divine in the human forces in the earth plane. The entity was in the name Arsha and was the stone and precious stone designer during the Rata period. The entity also gave the geometrical forces to the people, being then the mathematician and an assistant to the astrologer and soothsayer of the day. He arranged then for the first monuments that were being restored and builded in those places, being then the founder of what is called the mystery of mysteries, the Sphinx. They say, what is the name of the ruler during this period in Egypt? Cayce answers, Ararat. A-R-A-A-R-A-A-R-T. Ararat. In what capacity did the entity act in building the Sphinx? As the monuments were being rebuilt in the plains of that now called the Pyramid of Giza, okay, rebuilt, catch that. Remember, he says you're in the Rata period. That's 10,500 BC. As the monuments were being rebuilt in the plains of that now called the Pyramid of Giza, this entity laid the foundations. That is, he superintended them, figured out the geometrical positions of same in relation to those buildings as were put up of that connecting the Sphinx, and the data concerning same may be found in the vaults at the base of the Sphinx. We see the Sphinx was builded as this. The excavations were made for same in the plains above where the temple of Isis had stood during the deluge, occurring some centuries before, when this people and this entity among them came in from the north country and took possession of the rule of this country, setting up the first dynasty. The entity was with that dynasty also in the second dynasty of Ararat. When those buildings were begun, the base of the Sphinx was laid out in channels, and the corner facing the Giza plateau may be found the wording of how this was founded, giving the history of the first invading ruler and the ascension of Ararat to that position. So we're already getting a kind of a powerful piece of information there. And what Cayce goes on to say about this is that when he's saying, well, these are being rebuilt, but he says the excavations were made for some in the plains above where the temple of Isis had stood during the deluge. And he will go on to say, in reference to this, that the entire area was underwater for 250,000 years. So before the deluge, we have a temple of Isis there in that spot where the Sphinx is. But 250,000 years earlier, there was another temple of Isis. Think about that. Well, in traditional Egyptology, You've got the Isis imagery and all the rest of it. And they put that 3000, 2000 BC at the earliest. Cayce brings it back, 10,500 BC for the pyramids and Isis and all the rest. And then he says, oh, wait a minute. They were doing archaeology then. This area that they were doing the archaeology on was the Temple of Isis, and it had been underwater for 250,000 years. So Isis and Osiris and this whole piece goes back way, way, way back. That is quite a a head flex, as it were. But let's go further still. Cayce says, yes, we have this sojourn. This is rather Ararat. Remember, he was giving a reading for who the king was, this Ararat? Well, in this one, he actually gets to talk to him. And he says, we find in time, as counted by men, 11,016 years before the Prince of Peace came into this land. All right, now, Jesus was brought into Egypt to avoid problems in Jerusalem when he was, I think, 2 years old. So he's saying this is 11,016 years before that. So it's basically over 11,000 BC. As to that accomplished, we find this is one of the highest civilization of this country in its present position, for we find the same country had been submerged for nearly 250,000 years since the civilization had been in that portion of the country, and the peoples had been overrun in the country in the various changes by invasions, east and north. And this ruler, Ararat, being then the second of the northern kings, followed the rule of his father, Ararat. Okay, there's something about this Ararat. Think of Mount Ararat. I think we're getting the hint of where this name is coming from. And began the rule, took the position as the leader in his 16th year. He's 16 years old, he becomes the king. Boy, you grow up fast in ancient Egypt. He ruled over these people for 98 years. The country, as we find, was brought to a higher state of understanding with the surrounding nations, and there was much of the religious ceremonies practiced in the time, much of this being brought in from the northern country of the religions as existed in the same country, through the religion of that one taken as the companion. For there were many taken with the unearthing of the tribal rites and ceremonies. And so he goes on, and he has an interesting little piece there. He says, as we see, the first foundations of the emblematical condition as is set in the Sphinx was begun in this rule. For this, as we see, has remained the mystery of the ages. Listen to how he describes the Sphinx. The emblematical condition as is set in the Sphinx. Emblematical, symbolic. So there's some indication here of what the Sphinx is. And we get the period, the snapshot. It's 11,000 BC is the period that they're putting together the Sphinx. Then, as we know, the plateau itself is much more ancient. So the upshot on this, in terms of the piece, is that the last piece that we need is about the Giza Plateau and the pyramids in relation to the Sphinx. I'm going to give you that here. And everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist. This is PawGate 2. This is our 5-year anniversary show. It's great to have so many of you here with us as we go down Edgar's labyrinth of the Hall of Records. And you can just feel we're getting deeper here. So they're asking him, they say, well, you've identified this individual as Hepsut, an influential person in the Egyptian incarnation. Can you give us more information about the completion of the Great Pyramid? And Cayce says, yes, we have those experiences of the soul entity, the activities, and the material Hepsut. And that's HEPT-SUPHT. Hepsut. In Egypt. Much might be given respecting the activities of this entity, who sealed with the seal of Alta and the Atlanteans, and in the aid given to the completion of the Pyramid of Initiation, as well as in the records that are to be uncovered. Hall of Records. As the completion of that called Giza, there was the mounting of that which completed the top, composed a combination of fluxes of brass, copper, and gold that were to be sounded when all the initiates were gathered about the altar or the pyramid. And the sounding of same has begun as given the call and the varied lands to prayer and to arms, to battle, or to service of any of the activities that become the guiding or influencing. The church bell, supposedly, Cayce says, comes from this tradition of clanging the top of the Great Pyramid for the completion of the Giza Plateau. At the completion of that called Giza, there was the mounting of what completed the top, composed of a combination of these. In describing then the ceremonies of dedication or of the activities that began in the keeping of the lines of the priests and the initiates in the order, the mystery schools, according to their adherence to the law of one that was initiated in the activities of Hepsut. You can see Hepsut was very important. The sounding at the head of the top was given to one that acted in the capacity of the headsman, as would be termed in some of the activities. And the priest, with those gathered in and about the passages, led to the various ascents of the pyramid and offered the incense to the gods that dwelt among those in their activities in the period of developments of the people. In the record chamber, there were more ceremonies in calling in the peoples at the finishing of that called the Great Pyramid. For here, those that were trained in the temple of sacrifice as well as the temple beautiful were about the sealing of the record chambers. So what happens is they build a pyramid underground that is connected through a vault on the right paw of the Sphinx. But this pyramid that he's talking about that's being set up is to hide the Atlantean records. So he says, for these records were to be kept as had been given by the priests in Atlantis or the Poseidian temple. When these records of the race, of the developments of the laws pertaining to one were put in their chambers and to be opened only when there was the returning of those into materiality or into Earth's experience when the change was imminent in the Earth. The change was imminent. Which change we see begins in 1958 and ends with the changes wrought in the upheaval of the shifting of the poles. Then the sealings were the activities of Hepsut with Rata. And he goes about describing how they sealed the Hall of Records, in fact. And he says, this was in a period 10,500 years before the entering of the Prince of Peace to the land to study, to become an initiate in and through those same activities that were set up by Hepsut in the dedicating ceremony. So what he has is Hermes, who comes in and sets up with Rata the entire Giza Plateau, and they're kind of ringing in a new era of humanity. By the time Christ gets there, he is the embodiment of Hermes. He's come back and he is taking on the initiation there in the Great Pyramid. This is Cayce's story of the whole plateau and why the records were set there by the Atlanteans in the first place. The only other piece I want to leave us with on this, and it is so riveting when you get to this part of it, it opens up so many aspects. But when he talks about the Hall of Records itself, there's only a few occasions where we get a description of what's in there. And they say, give in detail what the sealed room contains, the Hall of Records. This is Cayce's answer. A record of Atlantis from the beginning of those periods when the spirit took form or began the encasements in the land and the developments of the people throughout the sojourn, with the record of the first destruction and the changes that took place in the land, and the record of sojournings of the peoples to the various activities to other land, and a record of the meetings of nations of lands and the activities and the destruction that became necessary with the final destruction of Atlantis, and the buildings of pyramids of initiation with who, what, where would come the opening of the records that are as copies of the records from the sunken Atlantis. For with the change, it must rise again. Now, the position is very interesting about where he says the Hall of Records is. And here's the kind of whole payoff of Cayce giving us this information. But listen to how he describes where it is. This in position then lies as the sun rises from the waters. the line of shadow or light falls between the paws of the Sphinx that was later set as a sentinel or guard, and which may not be entered from the connecting chambers from the Sphinx's right paw until the time has been fulfilled when the changes must be active in the sphere of men's experience. It's between then, the Hall of Records is between then, the Sphinx and the river. So there's something about that shadow that comes over the shoulder of the Sphinx and falls right between the paws. And then somehow there's an activation there at a certain point. And boom, that chamber is available that goes from the right paw of the Sphinx out somewhere between there and the Nile River. So it's an amazing kind of overview that he gives us, and he takes us into that moment of what they were doing, what it was about, and the impact that it was going to have on humanity. So on the flip side, when we get to Yucatan, we've got Iltar basically taking the same precautions. And the other temple that's sunken there in Poseidia, that one's still intact. The Hall of Records is still there. So the way that they built these things was to just kind of survive any disaster and destruction. So when we look at these things, we start to get the feeling and the understanding now that the Hall of Records is an earth-changing moment. It's not just like discovering an incredible ancient monument. It is humanity rediscovering itself. So we can see the incredible precautions, but we can see also using that paw imagery that the group that's in charge of it, that he's talking about, the Atlantean initiates, they're using the paw as the snapshot. That is the fingerprint of what takes place. And that's why this rediscovery of Chak Mool by Le Plongeon later and the Piedras Negras ruins being associated with this paw stone, and that the Mayans call it paw stone, gives us that hint of these Atlantean groups working together in disparate locations. With that, Miss Olivia, your questions are up.
Okay, hang on one second. There's so much stuff here. Okay, so Pooper Fighter, psychic archaeology must certainly be partly referring to the basis upon which we hold our beliefs, not just what is buried in strata of earth. And Jen Passavant says, does the right paw refer to the right hand path?
Well, it's interesting because I think it may have been adopted afterward as the idea. And, you know, it's interesting too, because if you look at different versions of the Sphinx over time and you find later versions of it, it has its paw on the globe sometimes, or it has its paw raised in some fashion. There are Masonic rituals, and we're going to touch on one of them that involved this. And it was Gigi who originally showed me this one. But I found out things in relation, you know, the Masonic tradition relies heavily on the Egyptian mystery schools. And in fact, if you look into it deep enough, came directly out of it. So all of the builder imagery around the Egyptians and, you know, the great care, the Cleopatra's Needle and you know, these incredible structures, and the Sphinx being one of the largest statues in the world, it takes incredible craftsmanship, and you can't develop that kind of craftsmanship in a void. So the whole kind of Masonic understanding about it understands that you are applying principles, just like when you set up Washington, D.C., you're utilizing a number of things that are in that initiate's handbag of knowledge. So so that, you know, that is the original thrust. You have so many Masonic groups that go over the rails or whatever, but the thrust of it and the groups involved, they're coming directly out of this mystery traditions, no question. Yes.
Okay, on that note, Starseed 1776, is DJ familiar with the Masonic handshake called the Lion's Paw? Zach Robinson says, would love to hear DJ's thoughts on the Masonic grip. The Lion's Paw, used ritually in Master Mason degree ceremony, deals with resurrection and immortality, raising the candidate from, quote, death.
Yes, there's no question. And I have a couple of different things on it, including the description of the ceremony. The thing, I think it's so important, but the how it integrates with what we're talking about, it's so seamless that, again, we have this lion's paw involved in resurrection and the keeping of great secrets, that for me it's another thread in all of this. And it's part of this kind of substrata that is right here in the middle of this mystery. So yes, and I think the imagery comes directly from this idea of being in the king's chamber and the resurrection that takes place there. Remember that in the mystery school piece, Jesus goes into the Great Pyramid to, just like he will enter into the tomb for 3 days and arise. He does the entire thing that they used to do in the initiates groups. You used to have to do it this way. You would enter into it and do this whole process with Osiris. But once Christ does it, everyone now has access directly to this immortality. This is the incredible thing about the mystery of Golgotha. But the lion's paw and the pyramid mysteries, this is literally one of the descriptions of it. In one of these, which is fascinating, we have on the person who's being resurrected the X on their chest, and it's the pharaoh himself. So the steganography is going so deep there. The picture shows the grip of the lion's paw was given in the pyramid mysteries. The priest wore over his head the mask of a lion. By this grip, the spirit in man, long buried in the sepulchre of substance, is raised to life, and the candidate goes forth as a builder entitled to the wages of an initiate. That's all true, but what's interesting is it actually represents physical resurrection. So, we have to remember that the entire kind of culmination of the mystery school activity, if you look over the Bible, you have the first wave of Passover and the passing over piece that we're coming into. Well, in the Moses time, what we have is, they're passing out, and that the angel of death is passing over them while they're slaves in Egypt, and then they pass out of Egypt and go into the desert. So that, their journey there from slavery to freedom. When you get to Christ, the Passover is from death to life. That is the mystery cycle. Now, in the mystery schools, you've got, a very mystically advanced Christ. So it is referred to as esoteric Christianity. In traditional Christianity, it's been so divorced from its mystical roots, which it created, which it founded, which it flourished, and it was been largely institutionalized. So they got rid of things like astrology, like numerology, like reincarnation. And in origin, during that period, they actually removed references to reincarnation. So you're looking at a developmental piece. Now, in any of these things, everyone's going to have their own particular identity around, how they choose to view how the mysteries integrate with their spiritual beliefs. So it's not going to come from me or anywhere. I'm just giving you that the esoteric Christianity works off of the idea that the Essenes were preparing for the incarnation of Christ by utilizing very, very deep esoteric traditions, and that whole period from 13 to 30 where Jesus disappears, he is training heavily with the Essenes in the deep mysteries. So that's something that goes back, and if you look deeply on the Cayce readings, you're going to find that Jesus is incarnated as Emilius. The Emilius group is an incarnation of Jesus. So, this starts to become quite fascinating when you get to the Great Pyramid era and the development at Giza with Rata setting up the Great Pyramid. And who is he doing it with? He's doing it with Hermes. So it seems like there's this guardian class, and that's where we get the kind of mystery school themes of a group that is working to not dominate the will of humanity, but to move the culture of humanity forward in a kind of a spiritually sound direction, shall we say. Yeah, that was a long answer.
That was great. Steiner to God. DJ, Steiner talks about the Atlantean connection to the Mexican mysteries and the aromatic nature of spirits like Quetzalcoatl. What do you think about that possibility?
Vitzlaputli, this is his fascinating overview. Well, what he says literally is that while Christ was being crucified here, that in Yucatan, the Ahrimantic, like the worst black magician on the planet, basically, was being removed by Vitzlaputli. And it was like this huge showdown to, just get rid of him. And that Ahriman had designs on the North American continent after causing the destruction of Atlantis. So when we get into Belial and all the rest of it, how far are we from the Ahrimanic thing? For me, they are wrapped together. That the thing that is referred to as Belial in the Cayce work is the same Ahrimanic spirit. I think what's interesting is also Ahriman in the Steiner work comes in through the technology. And it seems to me that if you really study Steiner's work, what you're looking at is someone trying to warn us over these 3 or 4 decades of work over and over again about this dark astral force entering in through technology in the period of the 21st century. It's there. It reads strangely because you have him talking about things, like Goethe, Schiller. He's going into these things that are very of the time and of that period, or the legend of that period, writing in about 1910, say. And, the influences leading up to then. So he sounds like a guy in his time. And then he steps out and talks about Ahriman, and he might as well be walking down the street in 2023. So this has always caught my attention with Steiner's work, even when I was very young reading it. And I mean, I read his work probably, Cayce's work and his work I read when I was like 9 or 10 years old. And I had a weird feeling about it. My feeling was, he's already looking at stuff that's happening. And by the time he starts to say that Ahriman will give everyone their own individual clairvoyance, but it'll be a clairvoyance that they can't share with each other, they'll distort, it'll set them off against each other, and you'll have the war of all against all, because everyone will be using their set of clairvoyance. I thought, as the technology came in, the Ahrimanic things that Steiner was saying about that, absolutely riveting if you think about it, and so ahead of their time that it's absurd. Just like Cayce writing about the things that the Atlanteans could do, it's absurdly accurate, but there they are giving it. So then my next question for all of this was why? Why the mystery schools dishing that out and getting it out to the public? And that gets us to, like, who's going to warn everybody that this is happening? They're moving through these channels. These movements happen. People live and die through them. They go through ups and downs. Some of them even kind of, like theosophy, largely go away. But they have an impact. There's a reason why these groups get together. It's like an unconscious knowing that they need to come back together and accomplish these things. Yes.
Brenda Fisher says Thunder Paw video game for Nintendo depicts a chimeric dog/man character holding a glowing blue stone.
Oh, well, I have the two-eye stone here. I showed it last night. Two-eye stone always fascinates me because I've been beating this one up today. This, as I've mentioned, a NASA scientist was so interested and thought what Cayce was saying was so scientifically sound about these two-eye stones that he was like, wait a minute, I want to have a look at what this thing would be. And this is what he developed in 1974 after working with Cayce's description. That is the two-eye stone. It's a 6-sided cylindrical crystal, and it works not just with the sun, but with any heavenly body that's on fire. So any of these stars can be activated through it. And then he also talks about it working with elements that are not available on the earth. Well, that's pretty interesting. And it reminds me of Cayce talking about what the original purpose of the thing was, which is largely, has a spiritual practice, and it gives you access directly. That's what it was for. That's how the actual Melius group used it. Yes.
Mr. Wolf says, my paw is currently grabbing chocolate almonds as I am watching tonight's amazing episode.
That's the only way to roll. Yeah.
David Tormina, DJ, reviewing the Le Plongeon information today, I learned that Joseph Smith and Mormonism as a whole were heavily influenced by this very same Mayan Egyptian story.
Well, absolutely. As a matter of fact, they basically created it based on the entire piece that Joseph Smith got with Moroni and this angel showing him these tablets and all of this stuff taking place in upstate New York, and he learns, oh, America has this whole background. We've been looking in, South America and all this other stuff, but it turns out America has all these groups. But a part of a major core of all that is a big piece of the story is the lost tribes of Israel. Well, during, the sacking of Jerusalem, one of those tribes takes off. What happens to them? And the Book of Mormon has them traveling in that long sea voyage and landing basically in Mexico and starting the civilization there. So there, you're always going to find the Mormons very involved in trying to prove the theories of, some other groups are involved. And in fact, I can say this in the Cayce readings that he says, yes, the lost tribe did actually come over here, and they injected into Mexico these Mosaic influences. And some of that wasn't so healthy, interestingly enough. So there's another thing to consider that Cayce says, Mexico, Yucatan, all of the things that are going on there, you have a number of different cultures getting together, and it becomes a melting pot of the people fleeing Lemuria, which has gone down in the Pacific, of the people who were native to the region, of the fleeing Atlanteans, of the lost tribes of Israel. It just becomes this incredible melting pot of influences. And there's a number of unusual stories about these bearded figures in that region, and people don't have beards in that period in that region. It's just a fact. So those strangers and, Quetzalcoatl and all the things that he does when he arrives, but he shows up originally with a white beard. So he looks almost like, Moses or somebody. Later, he's redone as Kukulkan, and he's a feathered serpent. But originally, in the original story, he's a man. As a matter of fact, what's interesting is if you go into the Montezuma, there's no reason why Cortez should have been able to take out Montezuma and completely decimate the Aztecs the way that he did. He came there with 50 or 60 guys, and they had armies, But he did show up with, the horses and all this other. He was more high tech, I guess, but they still could have beat him easily. The thing was that they associated him with Quetzalcoatl, and they thought Quetzalcoatl will return. And so Montezuma was in his own kind of fantasy that Cortez was that. And instead, Cortez used his own weaknesses against him, has him killed, and then takes out all of his warriors and takes over and says, oh, these terrible Aztecs, they're doing all this stuff, this terrible culture, human sacrifice. Let's kill all of them and take their gold. I mean, so this is the nature of the problem. It's basically, conquest after conquest. And one guy has a better reason. He's like, my God's better than your God. And I'm sure that, these cultures had degenerated by then, but he showed that he was on their same level by doing that. As a matter of fact, it's funny when Cayce goes back and has that vision of Cortez in that period, he says, oh, the things that Cortez did to the Aztecs. So, it's interesting when we get into that, because I think what we're looking at is you know, there's a sense there that the original culture that brought the Mayans to their incredible height, that gave them the mathematics, that gave them the astrology, were these visitors from somewhere else. And the visitors in this case, I think, were from Atlantis. Yes.
Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, was the two-eye stone cut for the Great Pyramid?
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting, which is the Sphinx is made out of limestone, and so is the Chacmool statue. So getting a crisscross of how that is. I think that the Power Stone activity, let's say, was so active when they were in Atlantis that when the Atlanteans come in to Egypt, remember Atlantis has gone down. So they're not able, I mean, they have some flying machines, they have the technology memory with them, but they're not able to activate a lot of it because it's like, hey, the grid's down. What are you going to do? So they have to learn to live in more primitive conditions. So I think it is weird. And I mentioned this about the Ezekiel description that Cayce gives about Ezekiel and how he sees all these wheels and this incredible spaceship. And when they asked Cayce, well, what about the Atlanteans? What did their craft look like? And he said, it looks exactly like what Ezekiel saw, except that was much later. And Ezekiel, in the middle of it, I put the quote in the description of the video, when he says, oh my God, in the middle of it is the big, terrible, mighty crystal. That's what Cayce said that they called the crystal, the Atlantean crystal, by that point. So somebody's operating an Atlantean ship when they meet up and scare the bejesus out of Ezekiel, who was no dummy. I mean, this was not, sort of a peasant walking around. Ezekiel knew a great deal by the time he has this incredible encounter. Yes.
Esoteric 369 Wall, were there possibly two sphinxes in the Yucatan as in the Giza Plateau, as is speculated? Did Cayce ever intuit two sphinxes?
I think that the piece about two sphinxes is true. And I think that in Egypt, this did happen. And this gets into psychic territory because this is a Gigi Young piece as well. She thinks that there were two sphinxes. For me, there are references that are involved that suggest, since they were looking at a constellation, that the Sphinx was made for this reason. But what's fascinating is the Sphinx at Giza is so important being set there. It's a representation of a number of things because you've got the lion human integration, and it's largely symbolic. But we know there was a period where humanity and the Atlanteans had actually crossbred humans and created cyborgs and what Cayce called the automatons. This is a very important piece not to leave out. And I think that in a way, everything that Rata is said to have done in the Temple Beautiful is to get this aspect of humanity back and fully integrated. So what they were doing, the Atlantean scientists, as is in the Cayce readings, they were mixing the human DNA and creating these cyborg slaves. And there are a number of different types of them. And like he said, some of them, they were created as artisans. Some of them were created as farmers. Some of them were, they just did everything for them. So one of the big problems that he says the Atlanteans have and creates almost a civil war in Egypt when they go in is it's fine and dandy, they come in and they are, they've got all these slaves, but then they start treating the Egyptians like they treat these things, these untouchables. And then it becomes the sympathetic piece around Rata is that the cyborgs are part human. So he wants them to be able to have a full human experience, not to be the slaves of the Belial group. And he also wants them not to be entangled in the animal kingdom. So, they're they're mixing things in there so they have the strength of a lion, but they're using a human being that they are augmenting so much to a point where they have no expression of soul left. So this is a real disaster. It's a dark piece. It's the whole kind of Frankenstein piece of the Atlantean scientist. And I actually have a quote for that, which I put aside just for this. Let's see if I did a good enough job here. Okay. Yeah, well, I'll just jump into this. There's a series of Cayce readings on Atlantis, which is just in a book called Atlantis by Edgar Cayce. And I find them just fascinating to jump in there. There was a piece when he's talking about Iltar, and he mentions the first temples that were erected by Iltar and his followers were destroyed at the period of change physically in the contours of the land. That now being found in the Yucatan and a portion already discovered that has laid in waste for many centuries was then a combination of those peoples from Mu, Oz, and Atlantis. Oz? You don't say. Oz. So there's a land of Oz. This is probably where the whole Wizard of Oz piece came from. So there's so much there. And what he says is, hence, these places partook of the earlier portions of that peoples called the Inca. Through the Incas were themselves the successors of those of Oz or Og. So we get that impression there that Oz or Og may have been related to, say, Peru or Nazca. And the only other piece I think that's important there, it says in the Peruvian land, and Mu in the southern portions of what is now called California, Mexico, southern New Mexico, and the United States. Then again, a change where there was the injection from those peoples that came from a division of peoples in that called the Promised Land. Hence, we find in these ruins that which partakes of the Egyptian, Lemurian, and Oz civilizations, and later activities partaking even of the Mosaic activities. So everyone suddenly is involved in that Southwest of America piece. And so we need to get the story straight on what happened down there. And I think he's giving us a real hint. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight, PawGate 2. And the PawGate piece is a huge realization. There's going to be a lot more coming out about this. So we're right on the cusp of these major discoveries, but we've also put some on the record. And a lot of this is new, and it connects the dots that these sources have been laying out there for us for many, many years. It's a very exciting dive that we're going to be taking into all this. And the other thing I want to stress is that, coming up, we're going to be seeing that things are going to come out about, say, this hidden chamber in the pyramid, or something about the Hall of Records, or something about the Temple Rising and Land Rising. There's going to be a discovery about this, and either it's going to get out there and be unencumbered, it'll be like a Polina Zalitsky type discovery where they can't shut it down till later, or they're going to invent one. So remember that thing that I've been putting forward about potency and how these subjects and the way that we approach them, we really need to do it from a level of potency and have a kind of integrity about it, because we're seeing a lot of things, around the independent research space, and, a lot of forces coming in, trying to control the narrative. One, trying to make it, part of their marketing machine. So I've called it Fox News disclosure at times, or, or whether it's the Gaia washout of the material. We have to definitely, be coming from a place and be able to kind of move on and call out the some of the kind of trashier, lightweight versions of this stuff, and also know where that potency is and drive people to where the potent information is, because in the period that we're in, you can't afford to have this kind of fluff version of things. And I should think that right now there's a kind of a thing coming to a head about this. I used to talk when I was speaking about these groups coming in around the UFO file, about how you had marketing groups coming in heavily over here, and then you had intel groups coming in here, and there's this narrow kind of corridor right down the middle where you can get the real thing. And that space is tight now. It's a tight avenue to get through. But I've identified where I think that potency is, and it's going to be very important. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, let's try to get through as many as possible because I've got such great questions, and I want to make sure that
We'll get at least 3 more.
Oh, 3. Okay. All right. Let me just group a few Sphinx questions together. Okay. So, no rush at For Life. Are the Sphinxes like hybrids from Atlantis? And CT says, DJ, what do you think about the Sphinxes in Romania and Sedona, ruins of much older ones? Question mark. And Najat Madri says, could all these Sphinxes be of one universal God?
Yeah, those are all very interesting questions. The Romania thing is interesting because for a while you've seen this stuff roll around about a Romanian Hall of Records, and it's very interesting. And I think that there are older locations where some of this stuff, people split off from the Egyptian mystery schools and went somewhere else. Gurdjieff mentioned Central Asia as basically the home base of a large part of the Sarmoon Brotherhood. So, you have to consider they would go where it's desolate, places like Afghanistan and other places. As a matter of fact, it got weird, I thought, when they were using bunker busters in places like Afghanistan. I was like, who exactly are they bombing over there? And don't get me wrong, like there were some far out stories pushed about, like, oh, these giants are out there and they're trying to bomb them. I think the schools have networks, and I think that their location changes. So, one of the things that Gurdjieff talks about in terms of Notre Dame, for example, is that the mystery school moved in there. They had something in mind in France. They moved along, At a certain point, he says, they decided to split up the mystery schools because they were being so persecuted. And they said, we're going to move philosophy over here to India. We're going to move practice over here to, like Iran and that kind of area. And we're going to move, philosophy, practice, and these other, training. We're going to move into Egypt. So they would split up the different things. And the people who were studying then could go and say, well, I've done the philosophical part, I've done the practice part, and so on. But they got very wise about how to survive. And this gets to a core thing, and why I think the Gurdjieff work, which I want to emphasize, is very valuable mystery school understanding. You're dealing with human beings. So you get, some stories just like in theosophy where people take things too far or whatever. But the core, the crux of how innovative that Gurdjieff work is off the charts. But one of the things that he said that stuck with me is that there are 2 pieces, crucial pieces. One is the how to do something, and the other is what to do. So you've got what to do and how to do it. So, for example, in a religious training, it would say, turn the other cheek. That's the what to do. And then, well, how do you do that, though? If somebody is on the street and strikes you, are you really going to turn the other cheek? So you need some special training in order to do that. And Gurdjieff's line was, well, the what to do, the religions always teach, and it's out there, and, the what to do is there. The how to do it stays underground. Because when it's up, it's persecuted because it's a threat. Because if you start training people, how to handle their emotions and run their lives and stuff, there are so many forces that are threatened by that, whether it's religion, politics, institutions, pharmaceutical companies. If you get to running your own show, if you know that you can do your own holistic health program and you don't need pharmaceuticals, well, that whole industry goes away. So, this has a lot. There's a lot of, I think, education in his statement. So we have to remember that, which is, how is the how to do it? Where do you find that? And I think in the brotherhoods and in the mystery schools and in that teaching, it's an interesting thing because as it comes into the modern era, you can look back even to the 17th or 18th century, and guys like Ben Franklin are getting together in mystery schools, but it seems kind of like a gentleman's club, and it might, even the Masonic thing might seem archaic with the outfits and everything else. So we're in a different period, and this thing is kind of morphing itself to catch up to the period. And I think we're going to see that mystery thing go through another type of transformation. So that's what we're in the middle of. Yes.
Simone Nyman. Does DJ think that demonic entities can infiltrate crystals, past, present, or future?
Yeah, I think a lot of these things are very much like who uses them, so they're all tools and it depends on your intention. And, some people want to use persuasive, like positive thinking, to get a lot of stuff, to get like limousines and Prada and stuff like that. And, you get the ability to do that if you're into that. That's the way it goes. But other people would try to use the same qualities maybe for different types of reasons. So it all depends. The tools are all there laid out. And so when it comes to something like a crystal technology, there's so many different ways you could do it. It's funny, it comes up in the Cayce readings and he says, look, you had an opportunity in that life. Actually, everything was set up because the way that the two-eye stone was working, it was making communications better. It was making power better. Everybody could do all these things, And he said, in a sensation, in a moment, an Atlantean could go anywhere in the universe. What does that mean? So they took that and they twisted it on its head as a way to dominate, subjugate, and eventually destroy. And we've seen, the Cayce story doesn't seem so far out because we've seen, ourselves, we have seen this whole process play out where, you drop an atomic bomb, right? Humanity did that 75, 80 years ago. So, we get a long way to get out of the woods yet. I did want to read a quick thing that, where's Dorothy? This is very interesting. There's two quick things, and this is where this is actually Plato's quote mentioning Atlantis, that I think is important as a root kind of teaching. And then I promise we'll still take a couple of questions. Okay. So I'll read a couple of these quotes. This one is from Plato, and the other one is from Queen Mu, the book that Le Plongeon did. Okay. So what we get is, this is Plato now. The famous Atlantis exists no longer, but we can hardly doubt that it did once. For Marcellus, who wrote a history of Ethiopian affairs, says that such and so great an island once existed, and that it is evidenced by those who composed histories relative to the external sea, for they relate that in this time there were 7 islands in the Atlantic Sea, sacred to Proserpine, and besides these 3 of immense magnitude, sacred to Pluto, Jupiter, and Neptune. And besides this, the inhabitants of the last island, Poseidonus. Just sounds exactly like Poseidia, as Cayce was saying. Poseidonus. Preserve the memory of the prodigious magnitude of the Atlantic island as related to their ancestors, and of its governing for many periods all the islands in the Atlantic Sea. For this isle one may pass to other large islands beyond, which are not far from the firm land, near where there is the true sea. Here is Le Plongeon talking about Queen Mu's exodus from Yucatan to Egypt. And remember, she came into Yucatan from Atlantis. Fleeing from the wrath of her brother, Ak. Ak gets remembered as a turtle in that mythology down there, AAC or AAK. Queen Mu directed her course toward the rising sun in hope of finding shelter in some of the remnants of the land of Mu, This is what's confusing. Churchward calls Atlantis Mu. MU, not MOO. MOO is the Queen Mu. So there's some wire crossed in the middle of this, but I find it very fascinating. Either way, it relates to Atlantis. Failing, and he mentions the Azores as part of the remnants of Atlantis. Failing to fall in with such a place of refuge as she was seeking, she continued her journey eastward and at last reached the Mayan colonies that for many years had been established on the banks of the Nile. The settlers received her with open arms, called her little sister, Isis, and proclaimed her their queen. Before leaving her mother country in the west, she had caused to be erected not only a memorial hall to the memory of her brother husband, but also a superb mausoleum in which were placed his remains and a statue representing him. That's Chak Mool. On top of the monument was his totem, a dying leopard with a human head, a veritable sphinx. That's in Yucatan. And I'm going to show it as I did last night. There's actually a sphinx that was in Yucatan. So I'll read this again. So she placed his remains and a statue representing him. On the top of the monument was his totem, a dying leopard with a human head, a veritable sphinx. Once established in the land of her adoption, did she order the erection of another of his totems, again a leopard with a human head. There's two sphinxes. To preserve his memory among her followers, the names inscribed on the base of the Egyptian Sphinx seem to suggest this conjecture. Throughout the ages, the Egyptian Sphinx has been given the enigma of history, has its solution at last been given by the ancient Maya archives. That's Le Plongeon. That's where he's coming from. Now, to round that out, let's take a look at that Sphinx. By the way, upon investigation, I found out the Sphinx has disappeared. It disappeared in the 1880s, but nonetheless, it's pictured here. Many, many people saw it, and he was able to read the connection in the hieroglyphs as to what it was. That is the Sphinx of Prince Ko, aka Chak Mool, as a human head and a leopard's body. And there's the paw imagery for us again. And a closer look. This shot, 1876, and in the 1880s, the whole thing disappears. So this is the lost piece of history that we're looking at right there via Augustus Le Plongeon. There's the Sphinx connection. Chak Mool is Thunder Paw. He is the Sphinx. And also, Piedras Negras, where they hid the Hall of Records, is what the Mayans called Paw Stone. There's PawGate for you, staring us in the face. So then the next question becomes, what do we do with that? Well, this is a suggestion by our friend Augustus Le Plongeon, and he says, the mausoleum of Chak Mool was crowned by a most interesting statue. It was that of a dying leopard with a human head, a veritable sphinx. The prototype may be the mysterious Egyptian Sphinx, the most ancient monument in the valley of the Nile. This Mayan Sphinx, like the leopard in the sculptures, had 3 deep holes in its back, symbols of the 3 spear thrusts that caused Prince Ko's death. Thus it has come to the knowledge of succeeding generations that the brave Maya warrior, whom foes could not vanquish in fair fight, was treacherously slain by a cowardly assassin, this assassin his own brother, Ak. Just as Osiris in Egypt is said to have been murdered by his brother Set, and for the same motive, jealousy. And of course, Set hacks up Osiris into a number of pieces, and Isis goes around and reassembles him, and he goes on his voyage and rules the underworld. The crisscross there is just dramatic, in my opinion. So we're sitting with a mystery, and it's through Le Plongeon giving us this reflection from his years being right in the middle of it. And I think it's his psychic ability moving him magnetically into these different discoveries. Yes, Miss Olivia.
3 questions. Simone Nyman, has advanced satellite technology shed new light on the location of the Hall of Records? First one.
If it did, you're not going to hear about it. No, they're not going to give you or me the Hall of Records. We're not going to get our hands on it. They, I think, have been involved in a program of obfuscating the location of the Hall of Records, as a matter of fact. And they, as I said, took the money from the Association of Research and Enlightenment, and Hawass, as part of the Mubarak government, was blocking attempts by legitimate researchers to get involved here and find this thing. And he was just a nasty piece of work. I mean, Carmen Bolter told me remarkable stories about him. And what's amazing is the difference between him and the person that she worked with as her mentor, who was the guardian of the Giza Plateau. And he shows up in her original series. So we had one, very spiritual guy involved with all this. And then you have this phony National Geographic, government plant in there who is playing kind of both sides there. So this guy, they've tried to rehab his character recently. I think I've just heard that they were going to do some television special with him or something like that. But he had a number of cases against him, and there was a reason why he was thrown out with the whole Mubarak thing. So there's a lot of obstacles. There's a lot of scum in the middle of that whole thing, just like in the political process. And what we do in this program, it's interesting too, because we unmask a number of people for you. This is kind of a crucial aspect of the X series and all the work I do here as dark journalist. We must be able to see things as they really are. There cannot be, we'll just let the CIA take over the UFO file or something. You can't do it that way. Investigative journalism at its core is adversarial journalism. It is. It's never personal. It can't be, or you lose, because once you lose your objectivity, it's over. But it is by its nature. And I've used this example before, but if you're examining a company that is dumping, chemical waste and sickening a village like what happened in East Palestine, you're not going to be shooting baskets with the CEO of the company. It's not going to happen. So, and what you hear, if you take that down to something like the UFO field, for example, you have all these guys out there who have been letting that CIA crowd in. And when people like me step forward and point out the obvious inconsistency, ethical inconsistency in a position like that, their thing is, those UFO crazies, we gave them everything, and the CIA wants to work with us, take the win, all that stuff. What happened to those people? I wonder, because, I've talked with them, I've met a lot of them, and, they've deteriorated. And so that whole, and I'm not saying I'm good and they're bad. I'm saying I want them to ask the same questions that I am. So when we get into this, if you get intel people into a field like the UFO file, or if you get Hawass types in around the Hall of Records, you push back, you investigate these people, and you unmask them for your audience. That's what you do if you're a dark journalist, and hopefully other investigative journalists operate that way too. It's an absolute obligation. You cannot feed your audience to these people, this machine. And, I don't know, how do you sleep? I mean, I could never sleep at night doing that. So it's very important to call things out, be adamant. They've been talking even about this whole thing with the Trump arrest and stuff. No, they're saying, oh, you just, you Trump people, out there, you shut up, because we had a problem with you at J6. Well, we already know that the J6 thing was a myth. And by the way, you locked everyone up in their house for a year, 2 years. What do you expect? BLM and J6, like all that stuff happened, right? Burning down cities and all that stuff. How much of that was government instigated anyway? So no, you have a good ability to protest in a lawful fashion, guaranteed by the Constitution, guaranteed in the First Amendment, and you should use it. And you should expose the people like you should expose the Manhattan DA who is overreaching in putting a president in jail on behalf of a political party. So it's the same thing. And I don't care if you're a Green Party Democrat or independent or Republican, it doesn't matter. The point is, you can't let the system work like that. If Bernie Sanders had been president when he left, Hillary Clinton tried to get him indicted or something, I'd feel exactly the same way, even though I'm no fan of Bernie Sanders. So it's not a party thing. Everyone needs to rise up when that stuff happens and call it out. And you'll be amazed at the force of that, and you'll see why with something like the movements. If you go back in history and study things like Martin Luther King, when he did these peaceful marches, they had these incredible effects, so much so that if you look through the notes of the CIA and the deep state in that period, they're going, how do we stop this guy? Well, we'll send in provocateurs who will bust up windows and do all the stuff and try to make that peaceful movement look bad. Sound familiar? Well, those are the things that we need to call out if you're going to have a society that actually goes somewhere. So if you care about the culture, then you care about it on all sides. And there's no soft stepping it, when you get around intelligence stuff, and I know when I talk a lot about the UFO file, but that's important because there's a lot hidden under that. Like there's a lot, I could spend all night with you talking about things that are hidden in our life under the UFO file. So you can't blow it off, and you can't say, as so many of these researchers said to me, hey, take the win, TTSA is on TV, baby. This is, you can see that there's no place in a field like that for anyone who wants to do real investigation. So it's important that we kind of course correct on the independent side and say, we're not going to go in those types of directions. And when you get the CIA moving in, the CIA, which is an illegal institution in the first place, it's a totally extra constitutional function. How many times have they been hauled before courts and Congress for their illegal activities? It'll never end, but they always get off because there's a statute inside there, and the statute tells them they can do anything pretty much that they want. So you have kind of fundamental pieces. How long are you going to wait for 60 years to learn that an institution inside the government killed the president of the United States? It becomes almost foolhardy, and then you get things like Fox News running around and saying, oh, we're tracking down the JFK assassination, and they don't do anything, right? And so it just becomes like a weird buzz for a couple of weeks, and that's all they wanted was a ratings thing. That's the thing we need to avoid, and we need to get to a potent response. We need to get to the potent information based around these things. And I think it becomes important when you see how the figures like Lehner and Hawass sat on the disclosures and the things that we're talking about now. All of this could have come out in 1992, but we're, here it is 30 years later, and, we're breaking it open. But my God, they've been sitting on it. This is what they do, So you sit on the UFO file, you sit on the ancient disclosures, and you kind of move humanity into more and more of these splintered off, balkanized groups. So, the core thing that we can do in our study and in our research and in the things that we report on is we can bring our focus into what the nature of these things actually are. And when we see them flipping out and trying to create narratives and creating new names for UFOs and stuff like that, we know it's important. So yes.
Wow.
Miss Olivia.
Okay.
There's a lot there.
So, Black 2TH, I have an honest question. What is it we are to do if, in fact, a real disclosure were somehow miraculously granted to us? Then what are we to do with that?
Well, I think it would be a good thing, and I look for it in society. I think, the whole point is what we want to do is live and grow and move the culture forward, right? We want to live in a better America, a better world, a better England, a better France, and a better Ireland. We want to be able to move things forward on a cultural level. And if we got something that was useful for the society, then you just, you would get behind it and it would be a wonderful happening for the entire society. But I think the problem is there's been an awful lot of masquerading. So this is the nature of the problem. So there was a series of lectures that Steiner did called True and False Paths of Spiritual Evolution. The false path is always there. The false piece is there. So and so from this political party is a demon. You should hate them. Anyone who holds this position, if they're anti-vax, you should hate them. Can you imagine? So, if they don't support Zelensky and our war machine, you should hate them. They're not American. So we've had this thing. We live side by side with this propaganda machine, and there's a number of people in society who have grown up with no barriers to it, and so they take it hook, line, and sinker. So we run into major problems, especially if we find those people among our friends and family. Then it becomes very difficult. But what I would say is there's a possibility that things get through. And so whether it's on the UFO side, there's great research that goes on, which is the other major problem that I have with some of these fields is the stuff itself. It's so exciting that if you could get the kind of darker, sort of forces that are involved out of it, then you'd have a kind of a cultural renaissance. There's no question about it. But people always need to do their best on it. I don't think that there's anything. What was the John Lennon line? There ain't no Buddha going to come from the sky. Now that I found out, I know I can cry. It's not. I mean, there are wonderful things that just happen for us, but so much of it needs to be earned, I would say. And I think it's okay because people are willing to work. Yes.
Okay, ready to wrap it up?
Go for it.
Okay, David Termina. The CIA has been working their way into the Mayan mystery since the 1930s. The Banana Republics didn't happen by accident. Also, DJ, do you suspect that opening the Hall of Records is only possible when a certain type of consciousness is present, has made it impossible for the Belial cult to actually regain the lost knowledge?
Yeah, I think you have to be, in order to really enter into the truth of the Hall of Records, I think you have to be of such a kind of a pure consciousness that some of the sleazier plans that some of these groups have had, or say the intel groups who want to use, the ancient technology and the ancient weaponry for advantage and things like that, they study it so closely. And it's weird how inside the bowels of this intelligence machine, it connects up into, finance and establishment pieces, because what happens in the middle of all that is there's a great occult secret society piece, which people know very little about. And it gets caricatured, kind of like, oh, it's Illuminati or something. But there's some idea, even among the most, kind of vapid people, there's some idea that something else is operating. So my suggestion on that is kind of like, what you want to do is try to take in less and less of the official sources around these things and try to form a network of getting your information from very potent sources who aren't kind of, taking and squeezing you like a lemon. For me, the thing to do is to always know where the source is that you're getting the information from, and not to get over-identify with something. There's a big movement, like, they'll shove this video in your face on Twitter and they'll say, hey, look, this girl is getting beat up. Aren't you outraged? And you never want to see anything like that. But the pushing your buttons and see how you react, is not, it's a kind of a too simple solution in society, and so we have to be careful about how our buttons get pushed or how our time gets absorbed in these things. And we need to kind of like shift as much of that attention as we can, I think, to the things that matter to us in life, whatever they are. For me, they might be mystery schools and these X subjects and things. For somebody else, they might be something totally different. But whatever it is, I think, we should be about the business of discovering why we're here. And the consciousness is a big part of that.
Can you relate that to power and empowerment specifically?
Yeah, tell me how you mean.
Well, it seems to me that everybody sort of went to sleep, or they've been asleep their whole lives, and they let other people be in power. They trusted the wrong people with power, and
Yes.
they're waking up to that. And so all of a sudden we're like, I got to take power back. How do I do that? And what you were just referencing is sort of on the ground,
Yeah.
day to day. Obviously, you've got to start with your body, with nourishment, what you consume physically, mentally, spiritually. We're weak. We're weak, and we're not used to this idea of empowerment, of taking our power back from people who really they're not worthy of the power that we've given them at all. They've abused it. They've abused us.
Oh, that's really true. I think you said it really well.
Okay.
Actually. And
but there are no guidelines for this. We're doing it on the ground in real time, right?
David Tormita says, just do it, baby. It's hilarious. Well, look, these are really key points. I think what happens is, and we saw it over and over again with the programming around the COVID op. They'll do it with the UFO threat. By the way, they're already engaged in it heavily, and they despise anybody who doesn't toe the line on that. They're having, by the way, this month, UAP hearings, not UFO hearings, but UAP hearings in Congress. So that's one really good example about it. But I think a lot of it is don't believe the hype, and take the same care, like when you're telling your kids to do something, or when you're ever giving good advice to a friend or whatever. Take that same care with yourself around these things. And if you find yourself getting into the 1984 2 minutes hate thing, even about somebody who, it's worthwhile, they should be despised or whatever, don't allow yourself to be sucked in for that, because there's something about resentment which locks you in, which loops you in with the very object of your resentment. And you don't want that kind of attachment, I would say. So much of it is about identification.
Well, again, that is letting the narcissist or
Yes.
predator or whatever it is control you and your emotions and your attention. It's
wow, is that true?
You have to be more aloof.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
And they hate that.
Wow. Well, it's been fantastic to be with so many of you. I think I showed this one. This is actually on the Masonic Temple, the 33rd Scottish Rite Masonic Temple. And there you are with the Sphinx paw imagery. It's deep, deep in the groups, and there's a deep understanding about that. A PawGate comes around, and remember, when they laid this thing out, they laid it out, according to Cayce, as a sentinel for those Hall of Records there, protecting this information, which I think is so important. And this is the era where we get to open these things up and responsibly apprehend them and learn from them, and go through that incredible kind of spiritual evolution ourselves. And there's a great deal, I would say a great deal for us to learn on that. Thank God that we had guides like Cayce and Le Plongeon to lay down the train tracks, because otherwise be in big trouble. Some of those books that I mentioned, the mystical books, they often will portray that Sphinx paw, that right paw there on some version of the globe. And I found so many instances of that. It was phenomenal. But I thoroughly enjoy the revelations around PawGate. There's so much opening up around it. And I'm going to call in other fantastic researchers like Gigi Young and Dr. Farrell to look into this with me, because they have so much to contribute on this. And I can't wait to see what we all come up with together in the ideas room. Fantastic to be with you all tonight. And Miss Olivia, what do you got?
I have a bunch of super chatters to thank. Okay, get ready.
All right.
Jariki, Eurythmia's Fun, Jay Parsons, Global Atlantis, Terry Doherty, Calvin Center, Jordan Romew, W.C. Ray, Gooby Goo, Erica Swenson Elliott, Melissa Buffington, Debbie McAdoo, Occult Fans, Sun Hero, Giselle H., Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce, Doyle Wayne, Tanya in the Flux, A Royal Bloodline, S Space Ghost, Freya Anderson, Ghost Malone, Thomas Ball, Boba the Clown, friend of WMS, Farmer Dick, Christopher Lombardo, Jennifer Walters, CT, Nancy Mercier, Harvardian, Karen Carpenter, Ron Schooler, Jenny Runco, Gillenjoy R., Doreen Hewitt, and Bill Monahan. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Unbelievable. Wow. We really appreciate your support so much. And, it makes all the difference that you get behind the work that we're doing here so we can deliver these incredible reports for you. And to all our subscribers and supporters, thank you, because it makes all the difference in the world. And we are going to be back with a special report probably on Tuesday when they have the Trump indictment, and unless something comes up before then even. And then I wanted to mention this, the X series is going to come back later in April, but we're going to have a series of interviews and special reports for you coming up. And it's been great to spend this 5-year anniversary with you. What do you got?
I actually have a question to ask you. So we've been under emergency power since 9/11.
Yes.
Has RFK Jr. mentioned at all about revoking that? Would he have the power to?
I'm sure it would be the kind of thing that would be in his wheelhouse if he became president. Sure, absolutely. And it's just the kind of thing. But he's been dealing with so many like COVID emergency powers and things like that. I think that's where his emphasis has been. I've never heard him mention
I would
it.
love to hear him comment on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, this is something we have that's very exciting that's coming up, which is RFK Jr. is going to be running for president. So we're going to be watching that closely, and the whole thing around Trump and examining what they're trying to do here. And, they're trying to fracture our consciousness by taking these egregious actions. So, they're planning for more division in the middle of it, but we're going to do a special report on it, and we'll get a lot of background. I've been looking into it on a deep level. So that's going to be a very important thing for us as well. We have some very exciting shows and interviews coming up for you this spring and into summer. And make sure you're on that mailing list, especially if you're new. And it's a free newsletter, as I said, at darkjournalist.com. And, don't be shy. Get behind the program, become a subscriber, and support the work that we do here on this show. We very much thank you for it. I'm going to do a couple of shout outs on the way out here. I see Space Ghost and Thomas Ball, Golden Girl. What does that say? I have heard every possible show too for the 5 years. I never engaged in the comments though. Wow. Amazing. Olivia Wings Girl, she's out there. Look at that. Unbelievable. Occult Fan. You missed that one. Leo Moon Now says Occult. I like that. Excellent. Now you're talking. Raw Daw, Brenda Fisher, A Better World is Possible. You got it. That is the cliche of the night right there. This was spectacular. I agree. I couldn't have spent the Saturday night any other way. This is exactly what I wanted to do. And it's great to do it with you. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Gigi Young, we had David Tormina. David says, definitely a raised consciousness event tonight on Dark Journalist Live. High impact indeed. Well, thank you. You do great work yourself, as we know, on Twitter, and we're all grateful for the work that you put out there. Yes, Olivia says Raw Daw. I like it. Will we make it to spring, says Dean Tant. Yes. I think that some of the flashpoints that we're seeing, are very dangerous, especially when it comes to the Ukraine side. And the people who say that we'd never have a nuclear exchange, I don't know what pot they've been smoking, but it must be the Guatemalan Piedras Negras variety. Najat, I see and learn so much. Thank you, Najat. And you've been a great presence there in the ideas room during the show, and going really far back to the few years that we've been doing this. Fantastic. Johan Wolf. What else have we got? Even Sunny. Mark Pakal. Is that a That sounds a little bit like a Yucatan name. Hal Colombo, love to all. Thank you. Back at you. It's great to have you here. Shane Walker, time to go read some JPF. Yeah. The Giza Death Star is back, baby. Prayers for France, Golden Girl. Yes. My goodness. My goodness. Just remarkable. Space Ghost, Space Ghost. Love you, DJ. Thank you so much. Thank you, Johnny Parker. Melanie K. Did I sign up for this? I like that. In the Bible, Mark Pakal. There we go. Huh, good question. See you next Tuesday. Paul Dubé gets the line of the night. We'll be here on Tuesday with a special report for you. And it's great doing the X-STEGANOGRAPHY series here with you. And I intend to continue to do that for you and deliver you these fine reports with the lovely Miss Olivia. Bravo.
Thank you.
Excellent. Congratulazioni. And to all our wonderful guests and the people who helped make the show possible, thank you. We'll see y'all next week. And no, we'll see you Tuesday, actually. Have a great Sunday. And,
right.
you know,
and rest up because this week is going to be crazy.
Whoa, is that true? You know, it says end broadcast after all, but
never really ends.
There you go. Never really ends. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been great. And we'll talk soon.
God bless.